In recent days, we've been talking about inviting a collective of hackers, online activists, to survey Sri Lanka's cyberspace, to look for misappropriated funds, to find out what has been happening to Sri Lanka's government funds. At the same time, we're talking about hate news, fake news, and the role of mainstream media and social media. We thought of talking about whether Sri Lanka's cyberspace is secure, whether you are secure in the given circumstances. I've invited to our studios Mr. Nalaka Gunawardene, media analyst, a social media expert, as we call you. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you. And we also have with us Mr. Asela Waidyalankara, cybersecurity consultant and educator. A very warm welcome to you too.
Hi, thank you.
Before we start off, I thought we see hashtag anonymous on Twitter, on Facebook and social media. A lot of information data being circulated on social media, and the protests are also mainly shared on social media. This is how we saw news and the kind of the campaign that built up against the current government also on social media. But let's start off talking about anonymous. I'd like to start off with Nalaka. What is this collective of hacktivists and cyber activists we're talking about? Internationally, we saw them expose certain data, certain lists of information, but is this linked to WikiLeaks or is it not? And what are the implications of inviting such groups to hack Sri Lankan web, the cyberspace?
Yes, thanks, Indeewari. This is more Asela's territory actually, but
right.
if I may just take a step or two back and slightly disagree with you early on, the ongoing protests that are distributed, that are many and varied, they have a very analog character as well. Physical, offline, real world character. In fact, if we recall, from around mid-January, there were, and coming forward, there were housewives and children and other citizens, men, women of all ages and all walks of life, who were coming to street sides in the evenings, sometimes with a candle in hand, and silently protesting against the power cuts, the many shortages of cooking gas, of petrol products, and overall the economic crisis building up and escalating. And this was offline. Then come March, we saw that more and more of these protests, very peaceful, citizens exercising their right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, that they were sharing their own photos, short videos on social media, which we can presume inspired others. Aha, so I see in Kohuwala or in Rajagiriya or somewhere else, people like me are doing, protesting the same kind of issues and problems that I face or we face. So that very likely inspired other ordinary citizens to do likewise. So there was no grand master plan, there was no coordination. It was more spontaneous, organic, and if anything, social media helped to document it and to inspire one another. This is coming up to the end of March. Then things suddenly moved to a whole new level on the evening of 31st of March, the Mirihana Protest, which started very peacefully. I was there, I am a resident of that area, and I saw that for the first 2-3 hours it was entirely peaceful. Then after around 10 p.m, suddenly the nature of that agitation changed. We don't know who, there is speculation on that. Those outsiders who arrived and started a direct violent confrontation with police, that changed the character of that peaceful protest. And so for the month of April, we've seen reverberations of Mirihana protests, which showed citizens that These random, isolated, peaceful protests need a bit more organized, bit more concerted effort. So we have, sometime in early April, Gota Gogama emerging in the Golf-Face Green. Now there is a Maina Gogama opposite Temple Trees, and support or solidarity protests in many, many different towns and villages across Sri Lanka. Here again, there is no one leader, one organizer. There is no political party, trade union, student union, or civil society group that we know of that is coordinating any of this. This is why it's inspiring one another, coordinated, if anything, through WhatsApp and others within each side. But there is no major island-wide coordination that we can discern. Tools are being used, both online and offline, but this is very much citizens asserting themselves and saying, enough is enough.
When we talk about social media, yes, there is an offline protest. There are people gathering across parts of Sri Lanka. The Golf-Face Green stretch has been gathering, has seen people gathering for more than 20 days straight now. And we see offline pressure on the government and the leadership to step down. And online, as you say, it's being documented. But at the same time, if you focus on anonymous and what this really is, what does it mean to invite hackers and cyber activists to ensure that they uncover and disclose financial transactions of Sri Lankan leaders. But what are the implications here, and does it do any good?
It's a bad idea. It's a bad idea because it's like bringing in an unknown, unpredictable, very likely damaging element into what has so far been a very peaceful, law-abiding, creative, noisy, chaotic protests, both online and offline. So Anonymous have been around for now nearly 20 years in various forms, from around 2003, and they are hackers with what they call a political purpose.
Right.
And they define it. The most recent example is when Russia invaded Ukraine. Anonymous decided, okay, this is something we don't approve of. We are going to hurt Russian cyber assets, and they started certain attacks targeting Russian government online holdings. Now, there have been other times when their action has been not so clear, and sometimes the outcomes have also been quite unexpected. Maybe Asela can go more into it.
Yes.
But once again, I want to say, knowingly or unknowingly, some among us inviting Anonymous to get involved in our national protest movement was a bad idea.
Asela, turning to you, I think we'd like to have a more expert explanation on who Anonymous is what cybersecurity means here. And yes, we've been talking about them being a collective of hackers scattered across the globe. But do we have members of Anonymous here in Sri Lanka? What does it mean to invite them, and how does it work to begin with?
Okay, so again, I want to thank Nalaka. He set the stage for this discussion. But just to dive in a little deep, Anonymous is a hacktivist collective. So they're a collection of hackers, and one of their ethos is in their name itself, anonymity. So when you are a member of that collective, one thing they want you to safeguard is your identity, because the actions that they take is very blurred, sometimes in a gray, you can say, and because of that they want the members to be not identifiable. They come together for collective actions, more like a protest in terms of an online protest, and it has a vigilante element also to it. And if you see the entire operational history of what Anonymous has done, they started in an online forum called 4chan back in 2003 and then up to 2008. Somewhere around 2009, they stepped out of that and started bigger actions. Some of the most important, most newsworthy things they've done is something called Operation Payback, when WikiLeaks basically put the dump of diplomatic cables. And MasterCard, Visa, and so many payment providers backed out. Then that led to Anonymous launching something called Operation Payback. Basically, they went after Visa, they went after Master, they went after all the payment providers, they went after the FBI, the Justice Department, because they felt that action was immoral. So this is the line they take. And beyond that, if you look at what they've done, most recently, like Nalaka mentioned, Op Russia, which they are going after Russian cyber assets. Previously, they supported the George Floyd protest, and they started to disrupt the various police departments' websites, including the witness protection programs. I must mention that. And if you go back, the BLM movement, a little more than that, even to the extent they exposed Donald Trump's personal emails, his social security number. And if you keep rolling back, it's more of a social justice with a vigilante flavor. That's what they've done. And they've specifically targeted cyber assets of an individual or a country and disruption. That is what they're known for. So let's take now what happened in Sri Lanka. So as Nalaka beautifully explained, there was a very organic protest movement for the hardships and the shortages in the country. Somewhere around late March, the last week of March, there was an online chatter or a conversation in social media to bring Anonymous, and Anonymous can save us. Now, this is a fairly misguided concept because I feel they misunderstood what Anonymous does. Perhaps, added to that, they misunderstood what WikiLeaks does, and maybe mishmashed the both in and thought that these guys can go after the leadership, then can expose financial misappropriation, sort of like a criminal justice kind of role they would play. And this conversation gained momentum. Somewhere in the first week of April, we saw that solidify as a hashtag, Anonymous Save Sri Lanka. So this hashtag started to gain traction. And what happened was, because of the traction it gained, it actually got attention from Anonymous. The actual Anonymous, because you must understand it's a distributed network. There are local members also of it who started to lobby the wider Anonymous collective that this is happening in Sri Lanka and step in. But what you must understand is the composition of Anonymous is varied.
So why is it so dangerous for Sri Lanka?
Good point, and I'm coming to that. Why is it dangerous? Because the composition is hackers, black hats, criminalistic elements, or people who are doing this, who've just learned how to do certain disruptions and want to prove it at a wider stage. So these are some of the personalities that are in Anonymous. Now, we call the last type of people called script kiddies. These are guys who have just learned how to do hacking, and they want to do it in a wider stage. These are the guys taking the lead. These are the guys maybe doing the disruption in the websites, because they are very basic hacks. But behind them, there are always criminalistic elements, people who are parts of cybercrime gangs, people who are in here to attack websites or organizations or individuals, harvest their data and sell it online. So there's an entire criminal ecosystem that comes along with Anonymous, unfortunately. And this has been well documented, not only globally, but for example, the Federal Bureau of Investigations has documented this, the Europol has documented this. So there is an entire mishmash of cybercrime gangs, dangerous individuals that are latched on to this Anonymous as well, or who will listen to that clarion call and follow the attacks here. And that is what the danger is. So if you see, for example, the first day that this supposed attack, April 20th, the Sri Lanka Foreign Employment Bureau, there was a leak of information. And that information can be sold in the dark web because there's identifiable physical addresses, there's mobile phone numbers, and there's email addresses. And although it might not look important, that actually has monetary value in the dark web. And when you do that, all of those individuals are at risk. Now, for example, another thing that we tracked was a business news site that got compromised.
Right.
And I saw the list, and there was a lot of corporate emails there. The danger is any one of those corporate networks are susceptible for a dubious email being sent to those people, them clicking on it, and therefore making the entire corporate network vulnerable.
That's how you'd be at risk individually.
Individually as well as the organizations as well. So this is the kind of flavor of risks that we have got in. So what we've done here is, if our risk was moderate before calling on anonymous, risk signature has now gone
But
higher.
what is it really, why did we resort to inviting anonymous? We have peaceful protests here. We had that building momentum as you very beautifully analyzed and explained to us. But then again, why anonymous? Don't we have, isn't there any other way we could really investigate into these misappropriations and expose transactions of our leadership?
There is investigative journalists, and they've done a brilliant job of it for so many years. Frankly, it's an insult to them and their body of work to ask for a nameless, faceless hacking group to come and do this. Because they've not done this, and they're not capable of doing this.
And they're not invested in solutions.
Exactly.
And Nalaka is a journalist, a science writer who has been speaking a lot about investigative journalists. But again, what do we do?
I can only speculate. I mean, it can be any number of motives that prompted the individuals to send out this open call. I can speculate that there is a lot of frustration. See, as Asela said, investigative journalists have been digging up, making connections, and spending months to come up with stories that have far-reaching implications about corruption, of connivance, and so on. These get published, but there has been very little follow-up on the part of law enforcement or those who are mandated legally and sustained with public funds to act. Then there have been also anti-corruption activists, both individuals and organizations like Transparency International and others, who are again exposing wrongdoing, the misuse of public property, for example, during election times in particular, and even at other times. And yet, no one seems to be held accountable. So this whole lack of accountability through national, domestic mechanisms may have prompted some individuals to say, okay, we've been watching this circus go on. There are journalists, there are activists who are exposing wrongdoing, and this is not small random acts of corruption. This is mega corruption, and yet the show goes on with barely a ripple. So maybe out of frustration, out of dismay, maybe some thought, okay, let's bring in some unknown element and see what happens.
But we
Bad
also
idea.
we did also see certain individuals being implicated as a result, directly being targeted, blatantly targeted with fake anonymous exposés shared online, and certain individuals being targeted, journalists being targeted. In this scenario, I'd like to talk to you about the role of social media. We saw Europe taking tight regulations. We saw the recent spat between Facebook and Europe. What can we do here in Sri Lanka during post-Easter Sunday attacks? We spoke heavily on the requirement to regulate or tighten the social media space, and also ensure that there is, while allowing for free speech, we ensure there are certain regulations that cut down or bring down hate speech and fake news. So in this scenario, what role can all these regulators play?
Well, social media is currently, if you look at the main platforms, Facebook, Instagram, then YouTube, TikTok, all these have self-regulatory arrangements, which simply means that any user opening an account agrees to a set of do's and don'ts or conditions, user conditions, and that is enforced to varying degrees of effectiveness. Some platforms have got better over the years. For example, Facebook wasn't good at enforcing their own rules, especially where single and Tamil language content was concerned 5 years ago. It's got progressively better. Still imperfect, but getting better. So all platforms have, well, most responsible major global platforms have self-regulatory codes which all users are expected to follow, and their content is monitored, and where there is a breach of those rules, there are consequences. There are consequences of account being suspended, and for repeat violations, accounts being deleted or cancelled. That said, this is proving to be inadequate given the vast volume and speed of user-generated content that is coming online. And even stepping up and throwing thousands of content monitors, human monitors, as well as using artificial intelligence to do the first line of monitoring and then flag potentially problematic content to human monitors, it's still proving inadequate. So can then more be done on the part of governments and state regulation? This is what Europe is trying out now with the recent Digital Services Act, which in a way is a last resort. Europe itself has tried. There is an EU code of industry code for the social media platforms on disinformation, and another separate code on hate speech. So those codes are like more than just the individual user rules and public commitments by these companies to monitor and react more in a more organized way. So the solution, I think, is a combination of user responsibility at all user levels, then platforms themselves stepping up and being more responsible for monitoring problematic content and dealing with it. Then, where those two are not enough, some sort of state regulation, but with adequate safeguards for freedom of expression. The danger in our kind of countries is it can be, a state regulation can be selectively enforced, so that critics of the government, for example, could be targeted, while those who are truly peddling hate speech or disinformation might just get away with no consequences.
Right.
This is the problem already with other existing legislation for offline offences. So we have to be very careful in advocating state regulation in countries like ours where rule of law is not yet well established.
Asela, when we talk about data protection, you highlighted why it's riskier. It has a heavy risk on individuals and corporates. But data protection seems to be very important. I mean, when we talk about countries now taking individual progressive action to ensure that data is protected. But how far are we from this? And what do we have to do now in order to ensure that our individuals and corporates are not at risk?
Complex question. So what have we done as a country so far? There was a huge lacuna in our law, which was, I would say, rectified somewhere in February with the Personal Data Protection Act. That act has been about 3 years in the making. There were various consultative rounds. I myself participated in a few. And obviously it was hashed, rehashed, reworded, and what you have is the final version that came out and Parliament approved it. So that is the law of the land. But of course, there are certain rights the individual has because of the Data Protection Act, as well as that envisages establishing a data protection authority, a state agency that is there to regulate wherever, whoever is having citizens' data, how they use it, are they using it for the express purpose they're using it for, and if there is misuse, you need to tell them to do it. Is those data adequately protected? If there's a breach of those data, Is the authorities informed? So there's a various set of regulations that are given in that act. But of course, that agency is yet to be set up. There is a problem in terms of skills in this country, because that is a data protection analysis, data protection enforcement is a very high skill job area. Even in the private sector, it is in short supply because we have certain organizations based here that need to be GDPR compliant. So to find that level of skill in this country for a state entity is questionable given the resource gap and given that good resources are migrating now. So I'll leave that there. But what can individuals do? So actually what had happened, if you just roll the clock back, when COVID came, we were thrown into the deep end in terms of digitization, because like it or not, we had to work from home. Like it or not, education activities shifted to online. Grocery shopping shifted to online. Banking shifted to online. What happened there was we exposed even individuals who had not had education or familiarity in a cyberspace into conducting transactions, activities online. Now that sort of is like giving keys to somebody and saying drive a car, but driving license is given, you are not given an idea of the road rules or nothing like that. Here's a car, figure out how it works and go ahead. So the danger is that we have not educated the people on how to protect themselves online, how important their data is, because even now I see this. When we talk about anonymous, when we try to educate people about the importance of government data or citizen data, it's not even government data, it's citizen data. The pushback we get is that's okay. I mean, let people know stuff about me. Let people get my data. I don't care. But that tells me we have failed in educating the people. The literacy level of what we are doing online is low, and that needs to be rectified. More than laws coming in, more than the state intervening, and I think it starts there, where we have to. And don't forget, we are asking very young children now to do education activities or learning activities, entertainment activities online, without discussing the dangers, without impressing upon the importance of why their data is important and why they shouldn't share their data with people. How do they keep themselves safe? Why are good passwords important? So all of that conversation is out the window, but they're just online. Right. So this is the danger that we are flirting with at the moment.
It's time we take a short break at Hydepark. How safe are you in the face of cyber threats? We'll talk about all this and much more when we return after this break. A very warm welcome. I'd like to ask you how Elon Musk's Starlink ensured that they have uninterrupted internet service to even the war zones in Ukraine. At the same time, in Sri Lanka, we see that I'm not sure what you call it, but signal breakers are being utilized to disrupt internet service, even at the Gulf-based protest area. But how do we link this switch with free speech to ensuring a stable society?
I'll have a go at it first, Asela, and maybe you can join me. The current data is that roughly half the population of Sri Lanka is now using internet, a little over 50%. And this has taken 26 years to get here. We introduced commercial internet services in 1995, April in fact, and now by the end of last year, around 52% of the population was using. But within that, it's predominantly the younger demographic who are online and using it for a variety of purposes, including since COVID came in, education, for schooling, for other kinds of educational activities. Online business, online, so more than just social media, for very specific purposes of government services online, citizen services online, rising volumes of e-commerce, education delivered online, as well as private communications of individuals and advocacy messaging and so on by different groups who have something to tell society. All this is being done online, so it has become very much integrated into our society, our way of life, not only our work but our leisure and recreation. And in such a scenario, disruptions of any kind, now on the weekend of 1st and 2nd April, we saw certain services being blocked on in Sri Lanka for about 15.5 hours on the 3rd of April.
Yes.
That's the last and the most recent selective blocking of social media and instant messaging services that we have had, which by the way is a 5th such occasion. The first was in 2018, March. For 7 or 8 days, the previous government blocked in the aftermath of the Ampara and Digana violence. And then after Easter Sunday attacks, immediately afterwards, as in April 2019, as well as 2 other times in May 2019, there were blockings of the key social media platforms as well as instant messaging services. So this time was the shortest, 15.5 hours, and that's because I suspect there was massive criticism both within the country and outside on this being done at a critical time. And we are still in that COVID phase where a lot of activities, including learning, happens online. Kids need these services to relate to their teachers, to their schools, and a lot of other things have moved online. We cannot disrupt even selective services, let alone the whole internet. So use of internet and accessing internet as a basic communications right is now being recognized everywhere. Yes, there are still those who are not yet able to get online for economic reasons or skill reasons or both. Little by little, that percentage will decline, and more people will be able to access and use online services of their choice. Some may just use it for fun and for chit-chatting, others will use it for education, others will use it for businesses or advocacy or community mobilization, as we are seeing happening now. The choice of services and purpose is left to individuals. But ability to access internet and to use it for their own purposes within what is permitted by the law. We are not talking about criminal activities, we are not talking about illegality, but within what's allowed by freedom of expression and what is covered within the legal range of purposes, right, legitimate purposes, it should be possible. And any attempt by the Telecom Regulatory Commission, by defense authorities to block that, to prevent that, should be resisted. And we don't have guidelines. What are the thresholds? Now countries, democracies are increasingly recognizing, okay, right to communicate, freedom of expression is with some reasonable limits. Now, when it comes to online, what are the thresholds that need to be exceeded when a narrow short-term blocking might be justified? We don't have guidelines, but for example, India has, but India is a bad example because it's also the highest number of internet blockings is in India for any country in the world. But at least there are some guidelines. We need to have what I call digital curfews. Now for physical curfews, there are clear guidelines in the Public Securities Ordinance. Absolutely. When and how a curfew has to be declared, whether it's a local one or a countrywide one. The digital equivalent of that is not defined. If digital curfews are going to be occasionally justified, we need to know how, when that is to be implemented.
So who can do this, Asela? Where do we move from here? I'd also like to add to that WhatsApp messaging service owned by Facebook. We see a lot of content being shared on WhatsApp, whether it's information or simple messages. And there's also this disinformation to misinformation and fake news being circulated. But there is no way you can monitor that, because that's personal data and messaging. So where do we move from here?
And I just wanted to add excellent explanation by Nalaka. The internet and the connectivity to the internet is no longer a luxury. It is now considered equivalent to a utility. Like electricity, like water, it is now a utility. And once it is a utility, it is a part and parcel of modern life. In fact, the UN has gone to recognize even access to the internet is a fundamental right in their point of view, because the importance it gives in terms of the wider importance. And I just wanted to add to the point Nalaka made in terms of digital curfews and how it will impact, especially countries like Sri Lanka. Because the moment the Mirihana protests were going on, there were indications of disruptions to the network. There's a global agency called, based in London, called NetBlocks. They got in touch with me, and they wanted me to also just give on-the-ground intelligence on what is happening. Then they monitored the digital curfew, as Nalaka put it. Now, these don't bode well to Sri Lanka, because in a situation where we are appealing to the international community for aid, for financing, for restructuring, and we have a constant engagement. When we give out the signal that we will disrupt internet and based communications, that does not send a very good signal. And I completely agree with Nalaka. The way that authorities communicated to the telecommunication service providers, and you have to understand from one point of view, their licenses are with the TRCSL. So they are bound with the TRCSL to follow their directions. Their hands are tied. So what we need to find out is we need to formulate the methodology in which such a order or such a situation will arise, and that curfew is taken, and for how long, and what is the exact reasoning. This was none of that was provided. And actually what had happened is people were so used to these digital curfews, immediately, before even the announcement was made, people had switched over to VPN. And because of that, we saw that the anti-government hashtag, go home, Gotha, and all of that trending in Germany, in all the European destinations, in the Asian destinations, because people are using VPN. So it was completely ineffective. So if the argument is we are going to stop communication, we are going to stop fake news, we are going to stop the circulation of information, that proved completely inadequate and ineffective because VPN was always there. And now you have made people technically conscious to switch to a VPN when there is a block.
So in this scenario, what authority can we entrust this task with? Or should we have an independent consortium looking at this? A committee appointed to ensure that, they give recommendations to governments?
Clarity might emerge soon. After the April 3rd blocking of social media and instant messaging services, several fundamental rights applications have been lodged with Supreme Court by citizens challenging this, saying their right to free expression was violated. And some of these petitions have been granted leave to proceed, and they will be taken up for hearing in the coming weeks. Absolutely. So unlike the previous occasions, this time around, the act by the telecom regulator, apparently, allegedly under the request of Defence Ministry, is being challenged, challenged at the highest court of the land, which might actually lead to clarifying, was this justified? Those who carried it out will have to justify it, and then also some future methodology or guidelines for similar rare, hopefully, occasions will then be codified or drafted. Who should do it? Well, ideally, it should be collective decision, not just left to defense or any one entity. Because the first time around, we had one of those, it was the president's office that had, the previous president had ordered it, then subsequent occasions, defense. But this kind of arbitrary, undefined executive action needs to stop and have a clear procedure in the event it is justified, and also what are the factors that justify it. It can't be just a vague, unpublished intelligence assessment saying, oh, this is going to happen, therefore as a matter of, as a precautionary measure, let's block this. No, it has to be evidence-based, clear procedures that we need to evolve.
And as we talk about data protection and cybersecurity, shouldn't cybersecurity also be an integral part of national security as we talk about this in today's context?
Cybersecurity is definitely part and parcel of national security, because when you talk about national security, there are so many elements. I think we as citizens just focus on the militaristic elements of it, but there is food security, there's energy security, there's so many other levels. And cybersecurity now, because the entire world is moving to the internet, moving their digital infrastructure to the internet, governance is done via e-government. We saw the government of Dubai going completely paperless. So the trend is always to move into a digital space. If you are moving your critical assets or digital information, your government services into a digital space, certainly the security of that space becomes a concern. And I'm just giving an example. The government of India now has given a grant to the government of Sri Lanka to implement something similar to the Ada system for a national unified digital ID. Now imagine the amount of data that we are going to collect on citizens, including biometric data,
Yes.
That would be stored in a centralized database. What are the risks of that? How important do we need to make sure that that information is protected? How do we ensure that people who have only the required access, who will access that database and it is not misused for any other purposes? Also, will authorities have certain jurisdiction to overrule that and use that for many other purposes? And also, if you have biometric data, the next step is you can use CCTV footage maybe to crack down on protests. Because if you have biometric facial recognition and then you tap into a CCTV feed, there is a probability or high probability you can identify who is protesting. So what do you do then? Are you moving on to that? So those safeguards have to be there. Otherwise, it is completely pointless talking about digitization, talking about e-government, talking about moving to digital space without being conscientious of data security as well as cybersecurity. There is no point.
What can we do individually to protect our data and information in the interim? We spoke about how during this new normal after COVID-19 hit, how we resorted to work from home, then working at coffee shops to hotel lobbies, and we use public internet, and or we carry a laptop that is that has office information to these public spaces. So how do we ensure that these sensitive data are not shared with a global platform or are not exposed to hackers?
Good point, because now the line of work and personal space has been blurred because of work from home. The same device that you use to do your work may be the same device that you use to order your groceries, may be the same device that you use to order your medicine. So we see a blurring of the space. Because of that, because of these cross activities, the data that is on your machine, for example, if it's corporate data or if it's personal data, has a higher chance of getting compromised because of the activities you're doing. Now, for example, you said you go to a hotel lobby and you log into the Wi-Fi. The general practice we tell is never log into unsecured public Wi-Fis. So those are airports, any public terminals or anything like that, because there is a significant cybersecurity risk when you do that. So what we say is at least have a VPN or some layer of protection when you log in, because to ensure that your communications are safe and your data is in some way protected. Now, there are certain practices also you can do. I know a lot of people, they use passwords to access all these services. Because it's so we use so many services within one day and so many varied platforms, we don't bother to remember these. What we do is we use the same password and we recycle it over and over and over again. Now the danger For example, I'll take the recent example. Now SLBFE, the site was hacked and certain passwords were exposed. Take that situation. Now I can identify an individual and I can identify that password. If this is a password they have recycled to their Gmail, to their banking, maybe something else, that entire platforms that that person uses is now compromised. And whatever the quotient of data that is available then is now available to a third-party malicious personality. And this is the danger, because we see, right, it's fine, I mean, let people hack my Facebook, but no, that same password can be used to hack your corporate email, and your corporate email might have very important company-sensitive data, very important national security data, or any other data for that matter, that can be maliciously used. I'll give one example with something that appears to be not connected, but in terms of connected. Somewhere in 2020, popular singer Beyonce's iPhone got hacked, her iCloud. Her personal emails were published, and what happened was a certain hacker group went through those emails, realized that she was about to launch a fashion line. That fashion line was done by a Sri Lankan company, the manufacturing of it, very large Sri Lankan clothing manufacturing company. They identified that company and launched a ransomware attack on that company because they realized this was the connectivity. Now you see how two unrelated incidents had an impact to a corporate. Beyonce, who had no connectivity to Sri Lanka unless her data was exposed, and finally ended up a Sri Lankan corporate getting affected. And they were off for about a couple of days, their services were affected. So this is the danger we face.
So in this context, we see the government touting plans about digital ID. Does that mean we will be at risk, our data, our information, because we know very well that our state infrastructure in terms of cyberspace and cybersecurity are not the strongest?
My concern is this: wherever you have a concentration of information and data, so much of data about citizens, it becomes a very attractive target for hackers and malicious cybercrime gangs. In 2018, Singapore, which has far more advanced, far more mature cybersecurity systems, their Singtel data got hacked. And one of the people's data that got hacked was the Singapore Prime Minister himself. So his personal medical records were available online. So this is the danger. And even Ada, although Ada has been now given to us as a grant and similar infrastructure may be followed, somewhere in 2019, Ada themselves got hacked and the entire database was available online. So you have to ensure safeguards in place in terms of standards, processes, and I don't want to be technical, but how the databases are protected, who is the governance committee, and that governance committee should not be made out of even bureaucrats. It might be made out of experts or any other individuals or civil society groups, because you have to ensure that data is protected, that data is secured, and that data does not get into anyone malicious hands. Because if it does, it's a danger to the entire country.
I think the key here is data governance. We are not saying, no one is saying that don't go and digitalize these processes. That is necessary. But with adequate safeguards, even if there is no external hacking, just imagine having the personally identifiable information or data or biometric data of 22 million citizens in one place. Now, that is collected and stored within a government entity, maybe the Department of Registration of Persons, or maybe a new entity to be set up. Whichever it is, it will be part of the state infrastructure. Now, if, say, for example, the intelligence services want to access it to profile all citizens according to some factor, should that be allowed? Shouldn't there be safeguards? So this is why, quite apart from any hacking that may be done to the digital storage of it, within the government itself, there should be levels of access, levels of approval, who gets to see the full set of data and who gets on a needed basis on Part of the data set may be for public administration purposes. No, these are the data governance challenges that we face. And as Asela said, Ada, in a country that is a global cyber superpower like India, Ada got hacked. And also, even before the hacking, there have been civil society huge concerns about Ada collecting, amassing, storing citizens' data, and then possible misuse of it by entities within the government itself. So there are dangers within, there are dangers coming from without.
If we talk about the Sri Lankan context, do we have the expertise within the state, the public sector, to ensure that this is done, or how do we move forward? You spoke about the necessity to bring about these changes, to regulate or monitor, but how do we ensure that we bring that expertise? We have experts outside the public sector, but how do we absorb this into the state sector and ensure we have tighter regulatory framework?
I think the technical expertise is within Sri Lanka, it's available, may not necessarily be in the public sector. But we provide, as a nation, Sri Lanka provides IT, ICT services to many parts of the world, to some of the Fortune 500 companies and global corporations. So expertise, experience is very much there. But we need to embed that expertise as well as governance structures within government if we are to go with this sort of digital citizen identification database and system.
Right.
Would you agree?
Absolutely, and I just wanted to clarify two more things. There are standards, global standards that you can set for data in terms of data governance, which Nalaka mentioned is very important, which as a whole of a government, you can set. For example, there's something called ISO 27000, which main corporates have used. Now, for example, all of what Nalaka mentioned, for example, banks, telcos, they have that level of authority. They have that level of governance because those are protected information. Your bank account balance cannot be accessed by everyone. Unless you call the bank and that particular teller, you answer the security questions only, your bank balance is accessed. So similar safeguards need to take place, especially if you are amassing all those data. And secondly is global standards, because you can't just say, yes, we have all these people and they're governing it. It has to be accepted globally, and how you make it accepted globally is to be aligned to global standards. So that could be the ISO standard, there's a British BS 112 data security standard, so many other things. And you can work with agencies like the ADB, the World Bank, or somebody to formalize that standards. But it has to be in a way that it's acceptable globally, not only locally. And to answer your question about resources, even now SL Cert has certain people and certain individuals capable of it. Globally, cybersecurity has a problem. There is a skill shortage. Cybersecurity skills, certain skill sets are in high demand, even locally. There are guys that are poached and taken away because of their particular skill set. So if you really need to make this work, you need to look at a public-private partnership. You need to make sure that you have a holistic view to cybersecurity in Sri Lanka. It's not, the state can drive it or maybe can give the necessary input, but certainly it has to be a whole of country kind of effort, because there are so many different layers to it. For example, I urge you to read the Singapore National Cybersecurity Plan. I know we have a cybersecurity plan ourselves, but it's very clear how they go about it, or each vertical of how they educate, how they protect their SMEs, how they protect critical national infrastructure, what are the protocols here.
We have about a minute to wrap up the show.
So many things that we can do and we need to do to move forward.
Would you have something to add as closing remarks? Because we're about to wrap up the show.
Yeah, I think going digital is an imperative, but going digital in terms of public sector, in terms of citizen action and everything, going digital with enough safeguards, enough awareness is what's needed. And as far as citizens is concerned, because we started with them, there is a concept called digital citizenship, which is not just digital literacy, not just skill, but also the ethics, the responsibilities, and those together with the skill. Digital citizenship is what we need to promote in our country, in our society. As we move forward with rising levels of internet use, digital tool use, unless we do that, we will end up with digital monsters, not with digital citizens. Do we want that?
Thank you very much for your time. We had with us Mr. Nalaka Gunawardene, media analyst, trained as a science writer and widely experienced as a journalist across print, broadcast and web outlets. We see you very active on social media as well, so thank you for sharing your expertise. Also, Mr. Asela Waidyalankara, cybersecurity consultant, educator, and has been a cybersecurity advisor and an independent consultant in Sri Lanka and outside. Thank you very much for your expertise and for sharing your thoughts with us here at Hyde Park. We were discussing whether you are safe and whether our corporates are safe and government is safe going forward as we talk about cyber threats. Thank you for watching at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. We'll see you again next week with yet another episode. Good night.